Have you ever thought about what people used to get paid with before money became a thing? Grain, beer, livestock, and that's just the beginning. So, what's the origin of salaries? The weird ways people were compensated, and why salt of all things played such an important role? And stay tuned for the story of Dimitri, a miller from Prussia who received his first ever salary on January 24. I bet you'll like this one. Let's start with the word itself, salary. It comes from the Latin word salarium, which literally means salt allowance. You see, in ancient Rome, salt was incredibly valuable. It wasn't just something you sprinkled on your food to make it taste better. It preserved food, kept armies fed, and was essential for health. Salt was so important that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, hence the term worth their salt. Now imagine this, a Roman legionnaire dressed in heavy armor with a very serious face goes to receive his payment after weeks of marching and fighting. He's handed a small sack that feels heavy. He gets home, opens it, and there is salt. No coins, no treasure, but salt. Can you picture his face? Probably something like,
Well, I guess this is practical.
and his wife like, what the f? But let's go further back to some of the earliest recorded salaries in history. Around 3000 BCE, in ancient Mesopotamia, workers weren't paid in money because, well, coins hadn't been invented yet. Instead, they were compensated with goods. If you worked for the temples or palaces, you might receive barley, beer, or oil. You could think of it as a barter system, but organized. And yes, some workers were essentially paid in beer. I bet that would be a hit with certain modern employees. Now, here is where it gets interesting. The idea of paying workers with actual money didn't catch on until later, during the Achaemenid Empire in Prussia around 500 BCE. Workers were given silver coins as payment, making it one of the earliest examples of monetary salaries. The system spread as coin economies became more common. By the time we reach medieval Prussia, workers were receiving silver coins like Salaries or Groschen. But, and this might surprise you, even then, not everyone trusted coins. Many people still preferred to be paid in tangible goods like grain or livestock, because those were universally useful. After all, you can't eat a coin. Now, let's pause for a moment and introduce you to someone. Dimitri, a miller from a small Prussian village. On January 24, 1547, Dimitri received his first ever salary, a single groschen, freshly minted. For him, it was a moment of pride. He'd spent months grinding grain for the local lord and was finally being compensated with something that wasn't a sack of flour. Dimitri didn't know it, but his shiny groschen represented a shift in how societies valued labor. He took it home, stared at it, and thought,
What do I even do with this?
turns out, he used it to buy more grain. Life in 1547 was simple like that. But what about taxes? Were there taxes on these early salaries? Oh yes, taxes have been around for as long as people have been paid. In ancient Rome, for example, soldiers had to pay a portion of their earnings to the state to fund public projects and wars. Taxes weren't just about money. They could include labor or goods. This system, while essential for funding public works and armies, was often exploitative. Lower-class workers who earned modest wages for goods were disproportionately affected. For example, a farmer paid in grain might own half of it back to the state, leaving their family struggling to survive. This imbalance fueled frustration and, over time, highlighted the inequalities back into early tax systems. Imagine getting your payment in barley and then being told you own half of it back. Not exactly motivating, is it? For many, receiving a salary was a mark of status. It meant you were recognized for your work, whether you were a soldier, a craftsman, or a temple worker. But it wasn't without its issues. Salaries often came late, were inconsistent, or were taxed heavily. Wait, That sounds familiar. I guess some things never change. So why did societies even start giving salaries? The idea was simple: standardization. Instead of negotiating payment for every job or relying on barter, salaries created a consistent way to compensate workers. It also encouraged loyalty. Roman soldiers, for instance, were more likely to stick around if they knew they'd been paid regularly, even if it was in salt. Now let's fast forward to the modern world. Today, salaries are typically paid in money, often through direct deposit. But when did modern salaries, as in fixed payments for labor, became mainstream? That shift happened during the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. Factories needed a way to pay large numbers of workers consistently, so weekly or monthly salaries became the norm. It was efficient, and it gave workers a sense of stability, even if the pay wasn't always fair. And this is kinda interesting, how a country decides how much a person should be paid. In most countries, minimum wages are set by governments or labor organizations. For example, in the United States, the federal minimum wage for 2025 is projected to be $15 per hour. This is determined through a combination of factors, such as inflation, the cost of living, and debates in Congress. States often have their own minimum wages, which can be higher than the federal rate. Once set, the minimum wage typically applies for the entire year, with adjustments reviewed periodically based on economic conditions. These systems often get criticized because they don't always keep up with inflation or the rising cost of living. Many workers end up struggling to cover their basic needs. While minimum wages are supposed to act as a safety net, they sometimes make the gap between rich and poor even bigger if they aren't adjusted often enough. But does this system really help people live decently? Well, it doesn't. Minimum wages don't cover today's expenses, which leads to financial stress for millions of people. Now, here is something you might find surprising. The idea of salaries hasn't changed that much over the centuries. Whether it's barley in Mesopotamia, salt in Rome, or direct deposit today, the core idea remains the same: rewarding people for their work. Of course, today's salaries come with perks like health insurance or retirement plans, things that would have been unimaginable to Dimitri or our Roman legionnaire. But still, with all the perks, it's very hard to keep up with the prices today. So what do you think? Would you prefer to be paid in silver coins, salt, or a nice, dependable paycheck? And here is an interesting fact before we wrap up. The smallest denomination of US paper money ever printed was the 3-cent note during the Civil War in 1860s. Adjusted for inflation, its value today would be approximately 60 to 70 cents. While it may not seem like much now, but back then it could buy everyday essentials, making it more practical despite its small denomination. Imagine getting your salary paid in those. It was discontinued because it was just too impractical. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're enjoying these stories, feel free to support this channel with a like or subscribe. It's not quite a salary, but every little bit helps. I'm Natasha, and see you tomorrow!